Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Really pleased to have you here today. Today, we're going to be going through our Machinations 101 session to teach you a good understanding of all the building blocks of Machinations. We're going to go through the different play modes. We're going to get you used and familiar with the chart and how you can use it in your projects, learn some tips and tricks on keeping your diagram tidy. And as always, please do ask us questions as we go through. My name's Matthew, I'm the evangelist from Machinations, as alongside me today, as always, is the infamous Cesar, our legendary diagram architect. Please say hello, Cesar.
Hello everyone, hope everyone here will find this meeting useful, hope everyone learns something from it, and I hope you don't hesitate to ask any questions as we go through it.
And I'm going to seamlessly now transition over to our first model. So here's Machinations. There's a few things just to show you before we dive in and start talking about the different objects. At the top left here is our menu. This is where we can go and save, move, navigate through our different models. We then have our libraries. We have public, which is where we've created some templates and some ideas that you can use in your models. We also then have private libraries. So if you've created a construction and you want to add that to your library so you can use it in other models, you can. And if you add them to the team folder, this means that you'll be able to collaborate with your colleagues and they'll be able to add their models in here. So if they've created a construction or a part of a model that you want to use again, add that to the team folder so that they can then use it. We also have our image gallery. Simply hit the plus, drag and drop your images into here, and then you can use these to brighten up and kind of show images, help explain the story or the mechanic that you've got going on. You can then simply drag these around as you need to and position them where you want. We then have custom variables. We're actually going to have a dedicated session on custom variables coming up very soon, but there's also one already available in our YouTube channel. Layers just enable us to add different sections, add them to different layers. Then we can hide them if we want to, or make them visible, just so that we can tidy up our models and only show the core information we want to, especially if we're presenting it to other people. And also we have our history. So from here, we can then go back and decide how far we want to go back. Look at this. I started this model all the way back in December last year. And it really enables us to, if we've made changes, we've made iterations, we go, no, I want to revert back to another one. We can simply open that up and pick the one the version that we want to go back to. What we're going to be doing today is running down these objects in the panel here, talking about each one. But first, let's just talk about how to get these objects onto the canvas. First thing we can do is we can drag these objects onto the canvas and align them. We can then grab our connections and connect these two objects. You'll notice with these connections, if they've got an empty circle in them, that means they're not connected to anything. When they're connected to an object, they've got that little target symbol in them to show that they're connected. As well as being able to hit F1 and look at all of the keyboard shortcuts. So if I want to add a source, just hit S, D for drain, P for pool, and so on. There's also one more way that we can get objects onto the canvas, which is if I highlight one of the objects and then double click another object, it will add that to the canvas. If I don't hold any of the keys, it'll always add that to the right. If I hold the shift key and double click, it's going to add that object upwards. If I hold the control key and double click, it's going to go down. And if I hold the shift and control when I'm doing that, it will go to the left. And you'll notice that this is then perfectly aligned. I love to use this because it makes all the gaps between each object are equal and helps make really neat diagrams. But now that we've got our objects onto the canvas, let's have a look at what we then need to do to what these different resources are. I'm going to open up my 101 model. Here we are, objects. This is what we're going to go through today. It looks like a lot, but we're going to take it step by step. Up first, we're going to talk about sources. Now, sources are where we get resources from into our canvas. When we click on one of these sources, you'll see we've got these 4 different trigger states, and all of the objects have these different trigger states. First one is passive. When I hit play, this is going to get grayed out, This source is sat there passively. It's waiting for something else to trigger its action. There's nothing there to trigger its action. So it's become grayed out, and it's got that error message there of missing input, resource, connection, or trigger. So let's have a look at the interactive one. The interactive one's got the little click symbol. So when I click on this while the simulation's running, it's going to carry out its action, which is to create one resource and send it over to our pool. So as I click on this, it's going to carry out its action. This next one is automatic. And automatic means it's going to trigger itself each step, and it's going to carry out its action. So in this case, it's going to create one resource and send it over to our pool. The last option that we have here is on enabling. On enabling means it's going to carry out its action in the very first step of the simulation. So here our steps are ticking away. It's now just sat here passively waiting for something else to trigger it. So I'll do that again. When I hit play, it's carrying out its action, then it's just sitting there passively. Really helpful if you have an action that's going to start right at the beginning of your simulation, like the very first thing a player does or something else. Cesar, what are you using your sources for in your models?
Yes, so as Matthew mentioned, sources are here to create resources. The advantage that sources have is that they store an infinite amount of resources. So they are very useful when you want to generate resources. Think of it as, I don't know, a player earning currency from a game, right? They finish a level, they earn some currency. Maybe you don't know how much they will earn, maybe you don't know how much they will play, and you need basically an infinite amount of currency that you can potentially give them. So you would use a source in this case to generate currency. Think of a player healing HP when drinking a potion, right? That HP does not come from a limited pool of HP that the player can heal. It's an infinite amount that they can theoretically heal. So again, it would come from a source. Basically, any moment in which you need to generate resources, you would use a source node for it.
Perfect. Thank you, Cesar. Up next, we're going to have a look at drains. Now, just as before, these objects have got these 4 different trigger states. What we're going to do first is we're going to look at our interactive one. So when I click on this, it's going to carry out its action, and that action is to remove one resource from this pool, and it's going to drain it from the canvas. Our automatic one here is carrying that out every step. So after 10 steps, those 10 resources have then been drained from the canvas. And the last option here are on enabling. When I hit play, it's going to carry out its action in the first step and then wait there passively. As well as having these 4 trigger states, drains also have this second characteristic, which is, as well as triggering, we have our different actions, and those actions are either pull any or pull all. Now, what pull all will do, and we'll have a look at our interactive one here. When I hit play, our resources are coming in here. If I try and trigger this drain, it's not going to fire because there aren't 5 resources inside this pool. Once there are 5 resources, it will then pull those 5 resources in. So what pull all will do is it will make sure that it waits until there's enough resources to pull those resources in. So if there was a particular cost for something and the player needed a certain amount of resources to complete that. So in this case, our mana is building up. Once they've got 5 mana, they can drain those mana and cast the spell. If we were to then, here we are with our automatic drains. So here our automatic one is waiting until there's 5 resources available before carrying out that action. Here we have the same configuration, but with pull any. What pull any will do, it will pull up to 5 resources each step. But if there's only 1 resource there, it will drain that 1 resource. Now, Cesar, what are you doing with your drains?
Yeah, well, drains, as you can probably tell, are basically the opposite of sources, where sources are used to create from nothing. Drains are used to turn into nothing. So they take resources and they remove them from the simulation, from the execution. They are good in order to keep the example of HP that I had earlier with the player healing HP. I could say the same of the player losing HP. So when they take damage and they lose the health is not actually converted into anything else. It does not go anywhere. It simply disappears from the player's, let's call it, inventory. So that would be using a drain to simulate it. You can use a drain to simulate a certain let's say the durability of an item, right? So items decay slowly, and that durability could be simulated inside the pool, and you could use a drain to indicate the fact that the durability is decreasing. There are a ton of examples which can use drains, and yeah, it's basically the opposite of the source. Not much else to say.
Perfect. Up next, we're going to have a look at pools. Now, pools are where we store resources. So we've kind of seen them already, but just to go through them again. Pools, again, they have these 4 different trigger states. Here our interactive one. I'll click on this for it to carry out its action. This one's automatic, so it's constantly pulling those resources across. And then this one's on start. Now, one of the things that confused me when I first started using Machinations is here I've got an automatic source and I have an automatic pool. My pool is triggering one resource to be sent from the source. My source is also automatically triggering one resource to be pushed out of it into the pool. This means that although I've got a resource connection with just one on it, 2 resources are coming across each step. So if you ever see double the amount of resources coming across a connection, just look out for that double automatic condition. Just as we saw with drains, as well as pull, we also have a couple of other options. The next one being push. Here, these ones don't have anywhere to push resources, so they're just sat there passively waiting. These ones have got somewhere to push the resources. Again, we'll have a look at the interactive one. So I've got 10 resources coming in on enabling from our source. When I click on this, it's then going to push one resource into the next pool. So in this case, moving something from the inventory into the equipped pool to show that it's equipped rather than just in the inventory. And then here, our automatic one is sending those across each step. Just like with drains, we also have pull any and push all, pull all and push all. So just as we've seen before with drains, you've got to wait until there's 5 resources available. If there aren't 5 resources available, it won't trigger. And with push all, exactly the same way. It's going to wait until there's 5 available for it to carry out its action, and it won't be able to carry out that action until there's 5 available. Sometimes we want to be able to see the resources and these little counters inside each pool. Other times it's really handy just to be able to glance at it and see the number that's number of resources in there. We can adjust when that number is shown by adjusting this display value. So here it's got a display value of 25. So that means any more than 25 resources in here, which is the default, it will then start showing the number. In here, we have a display of -1. If we were to set that display at 0, it's going to be empty until resources start to go into it. I quite like to have the 0 shown in there so I know it's empty. So if we set that to -1, anything larger than -1 is then going to show the 0 in there as well for me. The last option we then have with pools are when we're capacity limits. So as default, the capacity is set to -1. So effectively it's infinite number of resources that the pool can hold. If we had a certain mechanic where we want to limit the capacity on there, what I'm going to do is here I've got a capacity of 4. And I'm using the overflow characteristic of block. What that means is once my pool has got 4 resources in there, it won't allow any more resources into it, and it's effectively going to block that connection so that those excess resources are left there. If we use the drain overflow characteristic, any resources over 4 that try and come in here will be sent to the pool, but they'll then be drained from the canvas so that they're no longer available. So we can see that these extra resources are being drained. Now, just like the kind of double automatic condition I showed earlier, this is another thing that kind of caught me out, which was the push and pull mechanics, making sure that we've got these set up in the right way. So here I've got resources coming into this first automatic pool, which is pull any. Here I've got a push any pool, but there's nothing to allow those resources to move between these 2 pools. So we just need to look out for the push and pull mechanics. So if your resources aren't moving around, just make sure that your next one is configured as you need. Now, Cesar, you've been coming up with some fiendish puzzles for us. Do you want to talk us through this first one?
Yeah, it's using the three nodes that we've been talking about so far. The source and the drain are automatic, so no gimmicks there. You've seen the concept of steps so far. You saw that one step means one action is being executed. There is no such thing as a concept of time, right? So a step is rigid. It will always mean one step equal to one action. Our question here is how many resources will the pool in the middle have after three steps are executed, and the options are 3, 8, or 18.
Perfect. So we've got an automatic source going into a pool and then an automatic drain coming out of that pool. So how many will there be after three steps? Do that maths on your fingers, lock in your answer, and then let's have a look. So after the first step, we've got 4 resources coming across. So we've got 4 there. Those resources weren't in the pool for the first step, so there was nothing for our drain to drain. In the next step, we're adding 4, but we're taking 2 away. Those resources were then available for the drain, so it's taken those 2. And in the third step, I'm sure you've guessed it by now, 4 came in, 2 came out, so it's going to give us 8 resources. So if you got that right, give yourself a pat on the back. Well done. If you didn't get that right, feel free to pause, rewind, and review what we've seen so far. Up next, we're going to have. Oh, sorry, Cesar. What are you using your pools for in your simulations?
Yes. Well, the pools are the node that everyone will probably be using the most because they are the only container that Machinations has. Well, in a sense, every node in Machinations is unique in the role that they play. So, but yes, pools are used as containers. So going back to the earlier example of player HP, you use a source to heal the player, you use a drain to remove health from the player, but you use a pool to store the player's health. You can use a pool to store player inventory. You can store items, you can store currency, you can store states, for instance. So you can say, has a player checked a certain room, and you can store that as a pool with a 1 or a 0. You can check if the player has the required key to open a door. Yeah? So you can check a lot of things, but basically they are just containers that store resources and can move them forward between different nodes.
Perfect. Up next, we're going to look at gates. And just as we've seen before, we've got these 4 trigger states. I'm sure you're used to that by now. So let's just have a look at our interactive one and see what this does. So here, when I click this, we've got a passive source and a passive pool. When we trigger our gate, it's going to move 1 resource through the gate into the pool. Our automatic one's then doing that each step. One of the important things with gates is that they're intermediate objects, which means they carry out their action during the step. So here I've got 1 resource going through 4 different gates into the pool. At the same time, it takes 1 resource to go in a direct resource connection directly to the pool. Where we typically use these are for distribution of resources. So here I've got a source going into a gate, then it's going to be distributed between pass and fail here. As well as having the different trigger states, we also have different distributions. So here we can either have deterministic or random. And this is the first time today we've really been looking at what it means to then have a Monte Carlo in your simulation. So here I've got a random gate with random distribution. Each resource that comes into that gate gets treated individually, just as it were if I would just be sitting here flipping a coin. So every time it comes through, Machinations is saying, okay, what are the chances of it being a heads or a tail, and distributing the resources accordingly. Just like in real life, if I were to sit here and flip a coin 10 times, statistically, I should have 5 heads, 5 tails. In reality, I'd get a whole range of different results. And if I did it for long enough, I would get 10 heads or 10 tails in a row. Machinations is going to treat these resources in exactly the same way. As well as using whole numbers, we can also then use percentages. So here, I've got resources coming through this, and they've been distributed 50% in each direction. And then here I'm using a random gate with 50% chance of going into each of those. It's important that we can't mix percentages and whole numbers. So here I've got a 1 in here and a 50% here. When I hit play, it's going to come up and explain to me what the error message means. If we have less than 25%, less than 100% on those outputs from the gate, Machinations will treat that as 50% chance here of resources being lost. So anything less than that, there's a chance that resources will be drained. If we're above 100%, there's a chance that Machinations will then treat this as ratios. So we can even put hundreds of thousands of percentages in total. Machinations will work that out for us and distribute the resources accordingly. As well as doing pull any, we also have pull all, just as we had before with our drains and our pools. So here it's going to wait until there's 5 resources available in order to carry out its action. And then the same with a kind of random distribution as well. There's one last configuration that we have for gates, which is to use these to trigger other objects. So here I've got a 25% chance of each of these sources being triggered. So I've got an automatic gate. It's trying to fire each step with a 25% chance of firing each of these sources. Here I've got a random gate with a 25% chance of triggering each of these sources. And if I were to leave this running, let me restart my simulation. In this configuration, only one of these sources could be triggered at any step. So there's no chance of both of them being triggered in the same step, with each with a 25% chance. Now, Chisar, what are you using your gates for in your simulations?
Well, a bunch of things. As you described, they are mainly used for distribution of resources. So when you have, let's say, an event that has multiple outcomes, you can use a random gate to decide the outcome. When you have a looting system where when you kill an enemy, you get some loot, but the loot is random. Again, you can use a random gate. When you want to distribute resources among players, you can use a deterministic gate. And also the example that you last showed with trigger gates, that's also very powerful. You can use that to determine the order of events. You can use that for a lot of things, but mainly you use it for distribution. And one very important thing that was mentioned in the beginning when explaining gates is that they are middle step nodes. So they do not take a slot of a step. They do not add an extra step into the equation. This makes them very powerful for using hacky stuff inside the diagram. You can overwrite stuff. You can influence the flow of resources by using gates. So I like them more and more recently. They are a very powerful node if you use them properly.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Chisar. Now we've got another puzzle for you here, just to make sure you understand gates so far. Here we've got a source coming into a gate. It's going to send in 6 resources each step. It's a deterministic gate, and resources are then going to be split between 4 coming to the pool, 2 going into the drain. So the question here is, how many resources will the pool have after 3 steps? I'll give you a couple of seconds to do that maths on your fingers or however you want to work out how many resources will this pool have after 3 steps. So I'll give you two more seconds to work that out, and then we'll start the simulation. So in the first step, we've got our 6 resources, 4's coming to the top one, 2 are being drained out. In the next step, guessed it, it's going to be 8 there. And then in the third step, we've got 12. So if you had 12 as your answer there, well done. Give yourself a pat on the back. Up next, we're going to talk about converters. Converters, as the name suggests, convert resources. So here we've got some coins and we're going to buy some arrows. It's going to take 5 coins and it's going to produce 15 arrows. So every time we click this, it's going to carry out its action. We don't just have to go up. So here I've got 5 resources being converted into 1 resource, as if we were buying armor. The buying of the armor costs 5, but we get 1 armor from it. And here we've got 5 being converted into 15 again. Just like gates, converters are intermediate objects, so they carry out their action during a step. So here, just as we saw with gates, 1 resource is going through these 5 converters in 1 step. And here, the same time it takes for one resource to go directly across. We can then even start to combine gates and converters in the same step. So here I've got a whole combination of converters going into deterministic gates, back into converters, back into gates, back into converters, all in that same time it takes for one resource to go all the way between them. If you are combining gates and converters, it's important just to be careful. Here we've got a 25% probability of a resource coming through this gate. We also have a converter. This converter is going to read that 25%, and it's going to cause some problems because 25% isn't a whole resource. So even when a resource comes through, it's not going to convert that properly every time. So it's going to mean that our simulation isn't quite going to work the way we want it to. So you see there, the resource didn't come out the other side, nothing happened. The way in which we can fix this is by just dropping in an extra gate here. This gate's got an output of 1, so the resource will always go through it. This means the converter can read that 1 as needed and allow the conversion to take place properly and just avoid any issues. So whenever you're kind of doing any of these gate converter type configurations, it's handy just to pop an extra gate in there so that the converter can work as you expect it to. If we wanted to, we could even adjust this value as needed so that it would be the correct recipe that we require. Converters, as well as obviously converting, we've got another configuration option, which is either to do a single conversion. So if I mark this one as single for a moment, it's going to take 5 resources and it's going to convert that into 1 on the other side. If I mark this as multiple, it's going to do as many conversions as there are resources available. So here I've got 15 resources coming into the pool each step. Every 5 of those is being converted into 1, all at the same time in the converter. Converters can also have multiple inputs, and here I've got 2, but you can have as many as you like. And this could represent different types of recipes or different types of configurations inside your game. So once this top one's got 5 resources, it's going to pull those into the converter and output 1. And then obviously we've got excess of this resource, maybe that's used somewhere else in our game, but it's going to carry on automatically here, carrying out that recipe. Although converters can have multiple inputs, here's a configuration where I've tried to have 2 outputs from it. You'll notice that becomes grayed out when I hit play. That means we can only do this, you can only ever have 1 output from a converter. If we want to, just as we were talking about kind of converter gate chaining, here I've got 5 resources being converted into 8. Then I'm using a deterministic gate on the other side of this to distribute the resources accordingly. Now, we've got another puzzle for you here. How many resources will be in the final pool after 3 steps? So we've got 10 resources coming from an automatic source into the pool. We've got 5 resources required going into the converter, and then that's on multiple conversions and it's automatic going into the pool on the right hand side. How many resources do you think will be in this pool after 3 steps? And my hint here is, remember, it's all about the steps. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to do that maths on your fingers, do that calculation, and then we'll have a look. You've got your answer? Great. Let's have a look. So after 1 step, we've got those 10 resources in that first pool. Next step, 10 more in there, 10 were taken through, so we've got 2 as the output. I'm sure you know the answer now. So after the final end of the 3rd step, we then have 4 resources in that final pool on the right-hand side. If you got that right, give yourself a pat on the back. Well done. Cesar, what are you using your converters for?
Yeah, converters are, as the name implies, used for conversions. Pretty straightforward node. You don't really use them for anything else. The concept of conversion is used a lot in different games. It can mean making an item from certain materials, converting a health pack into HP, for instance, converting experience into player level. When you start using machinations and you get used to using these nodes, you'll actually notice a lot more trends in games. You will notice that a lot of games use the concept of conversions, and you will find out that sometimes you are confusing what is actually a conversion with something which you believe to be a drain. You would think that converting a, let's say, currency into an item is considered a drain for the currency, when in reality it's actually a converter because you are transforming it into another type of resource. So converters are used, as the name implies, for conversions.
Perfect. Thank you, Cesar. Up next, we're going to talk about traders, but before we get into traders, we're going to talk about one more feature of sources, which is the different color options. So here on any resource that kind of produces resources, so as well as converters as well, we've got this option for what color we want our resources to be when they come out. So here I've got the 5 different colors all coming into these pools. Then on our resource connections, I'm filtering these by color. So I've got all the colors coming into here, but I'm filtering them back out into their individual colors using those resource connection filters. This is really important when we start looking at traders. So what traders do, very similar to converters. You'll notice that the symbol here for traders are 2 converters, effectively kind of top to tail. And the way in which these work is these are used for converting objects when there's a limited number of times that can be completed. Here's my interactive one. When I click on this, once there's 5, we're taking 5 blue resources and we're buying 1 red one. So I'll do that a second time. If I try and do it before there's enough resources, it won't fire. But also my trader then doesn't have any more red counters to trade with. So no matter how many blue ones are now available, it's going to try and carry out its action. But if there's nothing there, it can't carry that out. So really helpful if you're simulating a kind of a shop mechanic where you have a limited number of resources, whatever that would be, available to the player. Cesar, how are you using your traders?
Well, the best example that comes to mind for a trader in my case is a shop mechanic, as in a game like Skyrim, where the player has a limited inventory and limited currency, but the vendor also has limited inventory and limited currency. You may go to a vendor expecting to sell 10,000 gold worth of items, but the vendor only has 4,000 gold, so any more than that you sell will be sold for nothing. So in that case, where both parties have a limited amount of resources, a trader is a great way to simulate that exchange between the 2 entities. I would say that is the main use of a trader. Otherwise, traders, you can simulate with converters, kind of. It's a bit more complicated. Traders are pretty straightforward and simple. You basically check if 2 resources are available, and if both of them are available, you just swap places towards them. So it's a fairly easy to use them.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Cesar. Up next, our final object for this particular model, we're going to look at delays. Now, what delays do, as the name suggests here, they delay resources. So here I've got 1 resource coming in. When I click this interactive one, it's going to wait 3 steps based on the number of the output, and then it's going to produce that resource. So 1 resource comes in, waiting 3 steps, and then it's outputting on the other side. So if I look at our automatic one here, 1 resource is coming in each step. Each resource is delayed by 3 steps, and then we're producing those resources on the other side. So to get 10 resources from the left to the right, it's going to take me 13 steps for those to come through. And 1 is out, as 1 went in each step, 1's coming out each step. The other option that we have on our delay node is, rather than delaying, we have the option for queue. Now what a queue is going to do, this is our build queue. When I hit play, 1 resource is going to come in each step. It's then going to hold those resources. So they're coming in at 1 pace, but it's then only going to release 1 resource every 3 steps. So it's going to take 30 steps for all 10 resources to come into our queue and then be output into the next pool. Now, Cesar, what are you using your delay nodes for?
Well, delays So in the first example, the one with delays are perfect for cooldown type mechanics. You use an ability, you pass through a delay. It takes a couple of whatever unit of time it is for the ability to become available again. Once the delay is done, the ability becomes available again. You can use it for planting crops, right? Because the crops can grow in parallel. If you plant 10 different potatoes, they will grow in parallel. So all 10 of them will be ready by the end of 10 steps. And for queues, I would use them for mechanics where you have, let's say, buildings in a city where you can maybe not build them in parallel. You need to finish one and then start the other, or building troops in a lot of browser games. You have the concept of building troops in barracks, and you must wait for a unit to be completed before the next one queues up, and so on. So queues are great for that.
Perfect. Thank you, Chisar. We're now in our next model, which is our Machinations 101 connections. And here we're going to kick off and we're going to talk about resource connections. Now, we've been seeing these all the time so far, but just to go into a bit more detail and show you everything that these can do. The label that you have on here inside the formula, this is determining how many resources are going to flow along this resource connection. So when we have one, it's one resource coming across. If we were to put five, it's five. If we deleted that and we didn't have any value in there, Machinations will treat that as one. We'll just have the one resource going across, as well as putting a number or a whole number or an integer in there. It's important to note that Machinations only works in integers. You can't have 0.2 of a resource. It's either going to be a whole resource or not at all. Here, if we were to put all into our resource connection, it's going to move all of the resources that are available along it. If we were to do that from a source, that's going to be, as we mentioned, sources have an infinite number of resources. So therefore, we're moving an infinite number of resources over into the pool every step. Now, with a random flow rate, we can actually use the dice logic. So here I've got D5, so that's going to produce a number between 1 and 5 each step and send that along the connection. We can use some maths in here. So here I've got 1 D5 dice being multiplied by 3. Here I've got 3 D5 dice that's going to be sent across the connection. Or I can add those 3 D5 dice together if I want to, or even do an integer plus a random value to get a number between 7 and 11. As well as being able to control the flow rate with the formula, we can also adjust the interval. So here I've got 1 resource coming across every 2 steps. Here I've got 5 resources every 3 steps, or even 5 resources every D5 steps. So for a random amount of time between 1 and 5. We can also do percentages. So here I've got a 50% chance of a resource coming across this connection, or 2 times 25, or even a fraction of a percentage. We can even combine all of these into some complex configuration if we need to. Our resource connections can also take some of the maths.js functions. So here I'm using a random integer between 0 and 5, that number of resources. We could do a sum. I don't know why you wouldn't just put 8, but here we can do a sum of 1, 5, and 2, or lowest common multiple of 2, 3, and 7. Although you can use some logic in some maths.js functions on resource connections, they can't take variables. So here I'm trying to do the lowest common multiple between A and 5. That won't work. So when I hit play, this is just going to sit there and it's not going to, no resource is going to go across because we can't work out what the A is. Can't use it like a register. Now, Cesar, what are you using your resource connections for inside your models?
Yeah, as you can see, the sole purpose of resource connections is to transfer resources. Now, it is true that you can manipulate them via conditions and other things that we will see with state connections, but the most important thing to remember about resource connection is that you will be using them a lot because they are the only way in which you can transfer resources from one node to another. So it will your model, aside from the nodes that we've looked at so far, will be comprised of a bunch of resource connections and state connection on top of that. So you will be using both of these quite a lot. But for state connections, I'm gonna let Matthew continue because they have a enormous amount of uses and they are very powerful.
Absolutely. You can see here there's loads of uses for state connections, and we're going to go through each of these in turn. But first, we're going to kick off with one of the simplest uses, which is a node modifier. So a node modifier is when we use a state connection between two pools. So for each resource that comes into this pool, we're going to add one resource into this next pool. We then have a +5. So for each resource that comes in here, we're going to add 5 into this next one. We can go the other way and we can take one away, so -1. We can even chain these together. So I've got a +5 and a +2. It's important to note that data only ever goes one direction with state connections, so it goes in the direction of the arrow. So here, when I remove the resources from this left one, it's also removing those from the right-hand pools. This is really, really handy, and I use this all the time when we want to keep a track of what's the total number of gold coins in this example that the players received as they've been playing the game, and how many gold coins do they currently have. So I'll set this up so with a node connection with a +1. So as the player's spending these, I know how many gold coins the player has all the time, but I'm also able to keep track of how many gold coins has the player received throughout their gameplay experience. If you are doing this, it's important just to be careful. Here, if I hit play here, we can watch this one start to go wrong. So I'm adding 5 in here, but then we're trying to take them away from this pool and we're taking them away from this pool. This is going to cause all sorts of confusion and it's going to start to make it look wrong. These node connections will adjust things on the very first step. So if I just do one step here, you'll see it's then saying, well, there's 10 in here, there's nothing in here. There should be 10 more in here. So it's going to +1 for each of those. And it will also do that, and then it'll carry on its node connection activity. So it's added those 10 in there so that they're correct. And then if for each resource that comes in, it's still adding +1. This node configuration between objects only works between pools. So if I try to do it with a gate, it's not going to work. If I try to do it with a converter, it's not going to work. Gates and converters can only input via resource connections, not state connections. State connections can also be used to modify labels. So here I've got a resource connection with a formula of 1, and I'm using a state connection pointed into the pill. You'll notice as I move the pill around, it'll move the state connection around. When you're dragging these on, if you point them at anywhere on the resource connection, it'll automatically default and connect to the little pill. So in this configuration, when I hit play, we've got one resource coming across. But once this pool's got some resources in, it's going to add 1 to this resource flow for each resource inside this pool. So it's going to gradually speed up that connection. Again, we can use any numbers we want here. So here I'm adding 5 for every resource in here. Here I'm adding 1 for every resource. Taking 1 resource away, so it's making this slightly slower. And there's lots that we can do with it. As well as doing this on the formula for the resource flow, we can also do it with +1i, which will increase the interval. Therefore, it's increasing the amount of the interval between when resources are running down this connection. We could do -1i, or we can even get really creative and we can start combining these. So here I've got +1 on the resource flow and +1i on there so that it's increasing the interval. In the same configuration, we can also adjust percentages. So here I've got +1%, +5%, or even -1% to change the odds after a gate here. When we're in this configuration, we can also, as well as using +1, we can also use an override. Here, I've got a resource connection with a formula of 200 resources. So it's going to send 200 resources down, but it's being overridden with this equal symbol. So when I hit play, that's going to become 0 because there's 0 in here. Once this pool receives some resources, it's then going to go up to 6. So our resource flow here is going to be 6. We can also use this equals between pools. So here, even though I had some resources in here, when I hit play, it's going to override that and make it 0 resources. Then once I've got some resources starting to flow into this top pool, it's going to override this and make that the number. I've got a drain coming out of here, but you'll notice each time this pool gets updated, this pool gets updated as well. The next use case we have for our conditions are here. I've got some conditions, so I'm using greater than 0, and I'm pointing that at the resource connection. So once I add some, if I hit play, once I add some resources into here, this pool is now going to be greater than 0. So this condition is then met and resources will be allowed to flow. When we're using conditions, we can point these at any other objects, both resource connections and sources. So here, when I add a resource into here, it's then greater than 0. Our source can then carry out its action and send resources. And we can do this with any of the with any combination. So over here, I've got less than 3. Here I have equals 2. So it will only carry out its action when this pool is equal to 2. Let's just watch that. Then the resources can flow. It's now 3, so it's turned off again. We can even do ranges, greater or equal to 3, and even ranges. So here I've got a range between 3 and 5. Once these pools are between 3 and 5, this connection will then be able to run. It's worth noting when you're using ranges, it includes the numbers at either end of it. So resources can flow along this connection when this pool is 3, 4, and 5, not just the number 4. If we are doing this, it's important just to be careful of the trigger conditions of our other objects. So here, this is now available because it's greater than 0. However, there's nothing to trigger this source or this pool to carry out its action. If we try to combine multiple conditions to the same object, so in this case, the resource connection, I'll add a resource into here. As long as one of the conditions are met, that condition will be able to flow. So that greater than 5 isn't actually going to have any impact on the resource connection. But what we could do is we could combine these. So I've got one state connection coming into the connection. The next one is then going to condition the source. So this is now available and our resources can flow as expected. And conditions, these can be used with any other objects. So here I've got a source, I've got a converter, and I've got a gate, all being conditioned in the same way from the same pool. We can even use state connections to state connections. So this is adding +1 to this this condition of greater than 3. And up next, we're going to talk about triggers. Now, we've been talking about kind of passive objects throughout today. So here we have a passive source. Here, using this star symbol, it's then going to, when this pool receives a resource, it's going to trigger this object in the following step. So the resource comes in, you'll notice this flashes blue for a moment, it carries out its action, and that source sends a resource along it. When we're using these triggers, we've got this option of triggering the target object when the source object either receives a resource, sending a resource, or any change, depending on how we want to configure it. And it doesn't matter what the conditions are of the other object. One thing you do need to be careful with. So here I've got a trigger that's looking to trigger this source. Because this source is already triggering itself each step, so it's an automatic source, this resource coming in and this extra trigger isn't going to make any difference to the configuration. Triggers can be used to trigger all sorts of different objects, not just sources. So here I'm triggering a pool. Every time a resource comes in, it's triggering this pool to push its resources into the next pool. Triggers can then be used on any other objects, so sources, converters, and gates, all carried out there. We can even start to combine conditions and triggers together. So here, once this pool is greater than 1, it will then condition this pool to be available. You'll notice this trigger just went off. It's not going to do anything to that pool because it's conditioned not to be available. Now available, it's receiving resources. The next resource that comes in will trigger this into its push action to move those objects forward. So Cesar, I know there's lots of things you can be using your state connections for, but what are you using your state connections for in your models?
Well, lots of things, Matthew, as you would expect. Yeah, state connections, as you can see, by influencing the state of nodes, they are very powerful. You will use them, especially conditional statements, you will use a lot, right? Imagine a situation where at level 10, you receive the following reward, right? So you would have to check if the player level is 10, you would use a state connection for a condition, and you would then trigger the rewards. Imagine that you have passive nodes. So let's say every 3 days, you want players to receive a login bonus or whatever, right? Every 3 days, you're going to be using a trigger state connection. You're going to trigger the rewards that the player needs to receive. Those are just small examples that I'm giving out. They have a ton of different uses. Tampering with the state of nodes is a very powerful thing to have in Machinations.
Perfect. But we've got another puzzle. Do you want to walk us through this one, Cesar?
Yeah. We can notice we have a source, a converter, and a pool. The source is set to on enabling. As we mentioned in the beginning, on enabling only acts at the beginning of the execution or whenever the node is enabled from a deactivated state. The converter is set to passive, and the pool is also passive. You see that from the pool, we have a label modifier going up and influencing the output of the converter. And we can also observe a trigger going from the pool back into the original source. Now, the question is the same as in after 3 steps. How many resources will the pool have by the end of those 3 steps?
Perfect. I'll give you a couple of seconds to do that maths on your fingers, work this out, and then we'll have a look at the answer. Lock in your answer now. Right. After the first step, we've got 1 resource and it's converted into 1 resource. So we've got 1 resource in the pool. That +1 is going in and impacting this. So it's 2 next time. And this state connection with a trigger on is blue to say it's going to trigger the source in the next step. So then we have 1 resource, it gets converted into 2. So we now have 3 in here. This is going back and impacting the resource flow after the converter. So it's now 1 + 3 or 4. Our state connections flashing blue. And 1 resource is now being converted into 4, so that we have 7 there. So if you've got 7 resources and you got that one right, well done. That's a tricky one. There's lots going on in that model. You're going to be great at Machinations. Up next, oh, sorry, anything else you'd add about kind of state connections, Cesar?
Well, nothing that I've already added. You will use them if you want to build complex models with complex logic. You will use them a lot, and they are the best friend of registers, which we will talk about in a bit.
Perfect. 2 more objects to talk about as we come down on the left-hand side here through the panel. The next one are end conditions. And what end conditions are always used in conjunction with state connections. So here, when I'm using a condition of greater than 0, once this pool is greater than 0, it's then the condition is then met. The end condition is activated. So you see here, I'm ticking through the steps, but once I hit this button, it's then going to come through and it's going to cause my simulation to stop. Really useful when we're looking at kind of batch plays later on to kind of show that difference. And just with as we've seen with state connections, any type of condition will work with end conditions. So here I've got a less than 1. So if I take that last resource out of the pool, it's then less than 1. The simulation will then stop. These are really helpful. That could be an end game condition, like a player runs out of health or they've lost their last life. The simulation will then stop because of that, so that we can then examine the rest of the canvas to see what's happened there.
Yeah, end conditions are great, are exceptional when you have situations where you don't know how much your execution will last. So Matthew gave a great example. If you are simulating, let's say, a shooter game, and in the eventuality that the player dies, you would like to stop the simulation, but you cannot predict when the player will die. Instead of having the setting the execution to 1,000 steps, and maybe your player dies in step 7, and then you just 900 steps are executed for nothing, you can just stick an end condition in there, and then the execution will stop automatically when the player dies.
Perfect. So up next, we've got registers. Now, registers are one of the most powerful, versatile objects that there are in Machinations. Here, they're always used with state connections, and we've looked at all the different configurations of state connection. There's one more, which is to use these as variables. So here I've got the letter A. This is going to take the number of resources here and present that as the letter A to the register. We can put a letter in there, or we can put a word in there. And here I've got a formula, which is A plus letter plus word. So it's just adding up how many resources there are in these 3 pools. Nice and simple. We can also configure registers to be interactive. So here I've got a register. If I click this up or down during the simulation, it's going to adjust the resource flow here using that +1 configuration on the state connection. Worth noting that if I make this 140, the initial value was 20. So when I hit stop, it's going to go back to that initial value. So if I want to change the initial value, I can adjust this here. And here I can adjust how much the value will increase or decrease with each click of the button. So if I make that 20, 1 click will then make it 40. If I make that 10, I can then adjust that by 10 at a time. Where we typically start to use registers are if there's more than one condition that we want to have met to satisfy another object. So here I've got this configured as an OR register. So if you remember your kind of circuitry logic, your OR gates or AND gates, this is now an OR, using this register as an OR configuration. So I'm taking this number and looking at them to see if A is larger than 2. Whenever we have a condition inside a register, 1 means it's satisfied and 0 means it's not. So anytime it's 1, it will add an output of 1. So I'm using this condition of greater than 0 to condition this source. So if A is greater than 2, or if B is greater than 2, add those together. So that'll mean that if either of these are greater than 2, produce a 1, and that means that our condition is then met. So this one or this one are larger than 2, it will trigger our source. In this configuration, rather than a plus between the 2 conditions, I'm using the star as a multiple. So if A and B are larger than 2, effectively, that means that it's going to output a resource at the right-hand side here. So this is configured as an AND register. Any condition or any output in this formula, which is a 0, anything multiplied by 0 is 0. Therefore, both conditions have to be met in order to satisfy this greater than 0 output, conditioning our source. Now, Cesar, I know we're going to do a dedicated session coming up soon just about registers. What are you using your registers for?
Well, registers are special in the sense that they are the only node that can interpret variables. So that already makes them very powerful, right? Imagine that you have an experience loop where you want to convert experience into level for a player, but each level has a higher and higher cost in experience. The way in which you're going to calculate that experience is you're going to provide the player's level, which is stored in a pool. You're going to provide that as a variable inside of a register. You're going to do your math there with whatever formula you're using to calculate the experience needed. And then you're going to feed that back into the converter, which turns experience into level, right? So that's just a basic example. You can imagine that by using variables, this opens up to a million different possibilities with registers. They are the only node that can do math for you. So you will be using them a lot, whether you like it or not.
Perfect. Thank you, Cesar. Now, throughout today's kind of session, we've been hitting play and we've been watching these simulations take place. Here's a model we built a while ago, which simulates the kind of the points you could get as you're going through playing Super Mario Brothers. And it's great. We can watch this going on. We can watch our resources moving around and see what's going on. But once we've built our model, we might want to start to gather data from this. So coin points is something I might want to track. So I'm going to hit this show in chart. And I'm going to open up my chart for a moment. Now I've got my coin points added. Let's hit play there again. I might want to start building up more data to understand the different kind of ranges of results that players are getting. So I'm going to add some indicators. I'm going to add the average, the min, and the max, and start tracking how many points players are getting. Now, rather than watching the simulation take place to build up data, you might want to start gathering more data much faster. So for that, I'm going to hit batch plays, and I'm going to run 20 simulations. What that means in Machinations is we're taking the model, we send it up to the cloud, we then run multiple parallel streams of the simulation and really start to build up data very, very quickly. On the left-hand side here in my play history, I can then see all of those simulations I've just run, and it'll tick through and I'll get this notification to say that's been completed. So in those few seconds, I just ran 20 simulations and I've built up some great data to understand how many points that the players are then getting as they go through the game. So I've got an average, I've got a minimum value, and I also have a maximum value. So I can understand the range of results that we're getting as well as those averages. See, the more simulations you're then doing, the more accurate these then become. You can see this really clearly as each simulation is going through is gradually moving that average around, and we'll see that line smoothen out as we run more simulations and we've got more data and more accurate average percentages. Perfect. Anything else you'd say about kind of batch plays and kind of using the charts there, Cesar?
No, well, technically, if you're not building a diagram just to see the flow of the different mechanics in your game, this is kind of the purpose of building a diagram. Batch plays are extremely powerful for obtaining results. They allow you to see what's actually happening in your game. You can be a lot more methodical than just having coin points like you have in here. You can have them based on all of the different places that coins come from, and you can then compare, are we giving too many coins for this particular mechanic? Are we giving too few coins for the other particular one, right? So they give you a lot of insight on the sources and drains of your economy, and using those, you can easily iterate on them and adjust them until you are in a state in which you are satisfied with how the economy behaves.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Cesar. That's really helpful. That's everything we have for you for today to go through our Machinations 101 session. Please do keep the conversation going and come and join us, obviously, at machinations.io. We're on Twitter, we're on our YouTube channel where you'll find this video and lots of other videos, as well as our Discord channel. We actually have some more sessions coming up very soon. If you'd like to come and join us, we're going to be talking about understanding automated market makers. We also have our dedicated session on Machinations 102, where we're going to really dig in deeply into those registers and all the different configurations you can do just with registers. We're also going to be going through talking about custom variables and how we can use custom variables to really streamline our workflows, getting data into Machinations, make it even easier to work with. So we really hope you join us in those channels, in those other sessions coming up, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.